Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are discussing Deuteronomy chapter 7 today in our 5-minute Bible study. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, coming back for another day. You can get this PDF right here, this one, on our website for free at tobelikechrist.com, as well as all of the other studies that we've done. So go check those out if you haven't already, and also share them with anyone who you think might be interested in them. Okay. Deuteronomy chapter 7, when did these events occur? Same exact time as all the other chapters in Deuteronomy. Moses' speeches that are recorded in Deuteronomy, they took place right after the children of Israel finished their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. This would be approximately 1450 BC. The book of Deuteronomy tells us that it opens on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year after the Israelites left Egyptian slavery. And then to our characters, which also haven't changed, we've got the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're a great nation now, and their leader, Moses, who is leading them to the borders of Canaan. And in the book of Deuteronomy, he's talking to them one last time, reminding them of God's commands before he dies. And then moving down to our map, as we've mentioned several times now, these speeches were given in Moab, according to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, near Mount Pisgah, which you can see on the map. Okay, so chapter 7, I can't say that we're going to talk about anything like wildly new and exciting. This is somewhat repetitive of what we've talked about in the last couple chapters, but as we discussed, I think in chapter 6, the reason that these commands are repeated again and again is because the Israelites needed to be reminded of these things because they were common pitfalls that they would fall into later on in their history. So Deuteronomy 7 is a continuation of Moses' speech to the Israelites. Moses commanded the people that when they entered the land of Canaan, the promised land, that they were to cast out all of the Canaanite nations that lived in the land, and they were not to allow any of them to remain. Moses mentioned several of those nations, specifically the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I should mention that Canaan, the Canaanites, were a specific nation, right, that we just mentioned among those others. But a lot of times the Bible uses the term Canaan just as kind of a general term to refer to all of the promised land, all of the land that the Israelites were going to live in. The Israelites were reminded again that they were not allowed to intermingle with the people, to be their neighbors, or to intermarry with them. They were to tear down all of their idols and all of their pagan holy sites. And they weren't even allowed to take the gold and the silver from those idols when they destroyed them, because God said that those things were considered an abomination and they were something that was supposed to be abhorred, according to verse 25 through 26. Israel was to be separate from these nations in every way because they were a, quote, holy people to the Lord. And this is what chapter 7 is all about. The unique position that Israel had among the nations in their relationship to God. God had selected them for this privileged position, not because they were particularly special compared to the other nations, but because of God's promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And they were beneficiaries of those promises. And Moses reiterated to them that they would be blessed with protection, with health, with fertility, with wealth, if they kept God's commands. But if they neglected to keep them, then they would be recipients of God's punishment. Now, if the Israelites came to the task of conquering the land of Canaan and they began to doubt, like their forefathers, that they could overcome their enemies, Moses told them to call to mind God's 10 plagues on Egypt and all that God had done there to remind themselves, to preach to themselves that God had delivered them in the past. He was intent on empowering them into the future, and that this was going to be something that they were going to be able to do, maybe not by their own power, but certainly by God's power. And I emphasize that because that's going to lead us into our application. Israel was not selected by God to be his special people, his special nation, because they were bigger or more powerful or smarter or more industrious or more holy than their contemporary nations. In fact, they were smaller and less powerful than Egypt and the Canaanites. Israel's victories would be a display of God's power, not man's power. And the same is true of God's people today, the church, the disciples of Jesus. God does not need the richest or the smartest or the most well-connected or the most powerful or the most innovative people for the church to succeed in its mission on earth. Jesus' church will succeed in its intended purpose because God's power is working through it. So these stories that we read about in the Old Testament, they teach us that God is more than capable of working through weak, insufficient men and women to accomplish whatever he intends.